December 15th, 1944, 2334 hours. Forward observation post, 8 kilometers east of Bastogne, Belgium. Corporal Vincent Drake sat in frozen darkness with headphones pressed against his ears and heard the sound that would either save 5,000 men or end his military career in a court-martial before dawn. And the sound was German, not the crackling static of Allied communications or the careful coded transmissions of American units calling in positions and supply requests, but German voices speaking in clear, unhurried German about panzer columns and attack coordinates and a massive offensive that would begin in exactly 26 minutes. And Vincent sat there in a foxhole that smelled like diesel fuel and wet wool and the particular cold that settles into your bones at midnight in the Ardennes. And he understood with terrible clarity that 5,000 American troops camped 10 kilometers west had no idea they were about to be destroyed. The standard military frequency, the one he was supposed to use, the one authorized by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, the one that would keep him out of a stockade, was dead, jammed by German signals intelligence, flooded with enough interference that he couldn't transmit a whisper to anyone. And Vincent Drake had maybe 12 minutes to make a choice that violated every regulation in the Signal Corps manual, but might be the only thing standing between 5,000 sleeping soldiers and a surprise attack that would slaughter them before they could reach their weapons. His hand moved toward the frequency dial, toward the forbidden civilian band that peacetime law and wartime security protocol both said was absolutely off-limits for military use, because enemy agents could monitor it, and because it would compromise operational security, and because 100 different reasons that made perfect sense in headquarters, but meant nothing in a frozen Belgian foxhole, when you could hear German tank commanders coordinating the biggest offensive since D-Day, and nobody else was listening. Vincent Drake had never meant to become the man who broke the rules that night, because he had spent 23 years being exactly the kind of person who followed rules. The son of a postal clerk from Newark, who believed that systems existed for good reasons and that order prevented chaos, and that if everyone just did their jobs according to the manual, then society would function smoothly and wars would be won by people who respected the chain of command. He had joined the Army in 1942 with that same faith in systems, had trained as a radio operator at Fort Monmouth, where they taught you frequencies and procedures, and the absolute sacred importance of communication security, where instructors hammered into every student that unauthorized use of civilian frequencies was not just against regulations, but was actively dangerous, because every transmission could be intercepted, and every word could give the enemy information they would use to kill Americans. Vincent had absorbed those lessons completely, had graduated third in his class, had been assigned to the 28th Infantry Division as a forward observer radio operator, specifically because his service record showed he was reliable and careful and could be trusted to handle sensitive communications without improvising or taking risks. For 18 months, he had done exactly that, had followed every protocol, had never once transmitted on an unauthorized frequency or deviated from approved procedures, and his record was spotless right up until the moment he sat in that frozen foxhole and listened to German voices describing an attack that would begin before he could wake anyone up by running 10 kilometers through snow. The German transmissions were clear because Vincent had been running signals intelligence all evening. Standard procedure for forward observers was to monitor enemy frequencies and report any traffic that seemed significant. And for most of the night, there had been nothing but routine radio checks and supply convoy coordination. The normal background noise of a front that had been relatively quiet for weeks after the brutal fighting through France and into Belgium. But at 23:12 hours, the traffic had changed, had suddenly increased in volume and urgency, and Vincent had started hearing call signs he recognized from intelligence briefings as belonging to SS Panzer divisions that were supposed to be somewhere else. And then he had heard grid coordinates that made his blood stop, because they described positions directly behind American lines in sectors that intelligence said were lightly defended. And by 2334 hours, he understood that what he was hearing was the final coordination phase of a massive surprise attack that would hit at midnight. The Germans were using radio because they assumed American signals intelligence wasn't listening or wasn't competent enough to understand what they were hearing, and they were almost right. Vincent was the only American radio operator within 50 kilometers who happened to be monitoring the right frequencies at the right time, and who understood enough German from 2 years of high school classes to piece together what was about to happen. He had tried the standard military frequency immediately, had keyed his transmitter, and called the code sign for division headquarters 3 times with increasing urgency. But all he got back was static and the warbling electronic scream of jamming equipment that the Germans must have activated as part of their attack preparation. And he had tried the alternate frequency and the emergency frequency and every other authorized channel in his radio's range, and they were all either jammed or simply empty because everyone else was asleep or standing watch, but not monitoring because nothing had happened for weeks, and the front was supposed to be quiet. Vincent checked his watch and saw that it was 2337 hours, which meant 23 minutes until the German attack began, and he tried to calculate whether he could physically run the 10 kilometers to the American camp and wake anyone in time. But the math was brutal. 10 kilometers through snow and darkness over rough terrain would take at least an hour, even if he didn't break an ankle or get shot by a nervous sentry. And by the time he arrived, the attack would already be underway, and 5,000 men would be fighting for their lives without warning and without preparation. The civilian frequency sat there on his radio dial like a forbidden option, like the thing you were trained never to touch, and Vincent knew exactly what would happen if he used it, because they had covered this scenario in training with the kind of emphasis that made it impossible to forget. Using civilian frequencies for military communications was a court-martial offense because it compromised security, because civilians might hear classified information, because enemy agents monitoring those frequencies would learn about troop movements and positions, and because, even in an emergency, there were authorized procedures and backup systems and ways to handle communications failures that did not involve breaking regulations that existed for life and death reasons. But all those authorized procedures assumed your headquarters was awake, and your alternate frequencies worked, and you had time to follow the proper chain of command. And none of those assumptions applied at 2338 hours on December 15th, 1944, when Vincent Drake could hear German tank commanders running final radio checks before launching an attack that would destroy an entire division. Vincent's hand reached the frequency dial at 2339 hours, and he sat there for 10 seconds that felt like forever, sitting in frozen darkness while his training and his instincts fought a war inside his head that was almost as real as the war happening around him, because every part of his education and experience said that using the civilian frequency was wrong and dangerous and would create problems that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. But another part of his mind, the part that was doing cold mathematical calculations about attack timing and travel distances and the number of men who would die if nobody warned them, was screaming that regulations didn't matter when 5,000 lives hung in the balance. He thought about the lectures at Fort Monmouth, where instructors had explained that communications security wasn't just about following rules, but about protecting soldiers from enemy intelligence, about how every careless transmission could reveal positions or strength or intentions that would get men killed. And he understood those arguments because they were logical and correct under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances because the Germans already knew where the American positions were and had already planned their attack, and the only question now was whether those 5,000 men would have 30 seconds of warning or whether they would die in their sleep. The decision came at 23:40 hours, when Vincent heard a German voice on the radio say something about 0 hour and 20 minutes, and he understood with absolute finality that he had run out of time to find an authorized solution, that every second he spent trying to follow proper procedures was a second stolen from men who deserved a chance to defend themselves, and his hand turned the frequency dial all the way to the civilian band, the frequency that Belgian farmers used to call each other, and that resistance networks sometimes used for coordination, and that American military regulations said was absolutely forbidden for any military purpose whatsoever. He keyed the microphone and spoke in clear English, without codes or call signs or any of the security protocols he had been trained to use, speaking in plain language that anyone with a radio could hear, and that would definitely be intercepted by German signals intelligence, but that might, just might, be heard by someone at the American camp 10 kilometers away who happened to have a radio turned on and tuned to a civilian frequency at 23:40 hours on December 15th, 1944. This is an urgent warning to all American forces in the Bastogne sector, Vincent said into the microphone, and his voice was steady, even though his hands were shaking, and he could feel sweat freezing on his face despite the cold. German armor is moving into attack positions east of your location and will begin a major offensive at approximately midnight. Repeat. Major German offensive beginning at midnight. This is not a drill. Recommend immediate alert and defensive positions. Enemy force estimated at division strength with armor support. This transmission is on civilian frequency due to military channel jamming. Authentication will follow. And he gave his unit designation and his service number, and every piece of information that would let someone verify he was a legitimate American radio operator and not a German deception, even though he knew that giving that information on an open civilian frequency was another violation of security protocol and would definitely be used against him if he survived long enough to face a court-martial. He repeated the warning 3 times, speaking clearly and slowly to make sure anyone listening would understand the urgency, and then he switched back to monitoring the German frequencies to see if they had noticed his transmission or changed their plans. And what he heard made his stomach drop because the German radio traffic showed no change at all, no indication that they knew their attack had been compromised, which meant either they weren't monitoring civilian frequencies or they didn't believe that one American radio operator could possibly warn an entire division in time to matter. Vincent checked his watch. 23:43 hours, 17 minutes until the attack, and he tried the military frequencies again, hoping the jamming had stopped. But there was nothing except static and electronic noise, and he realized that he had done the only thing he could do. And now all he could do was wait to see if anyone had been listening on that forbidden civilian frequency, and whether they would believe an unauthorized warning from an unknown corporal who had just violated every communications security protocol in existence. The answer came at 23:47 hours, when Vincent heard activity on one of the German frequencies that suggested confusion or delay, and then at 23:49 hours, he heard American voices on a frequency he hadn't tried before, a regimental command channel that must have just come back online, and the voices were urgent and organized, and clearly responding to some kind of alert, which meant someone had heard his warning and had believed it enough to wake up the camp and start moving troops into defensive positions. Vincent felt relief wash through him like physical warmth, felt the terrible weight of responsibility lift slightly from his shoulders. But that relief lasted exactly 4 seconds before he realized that his unauthorized transmission had almost certainly been monitored by his own side's signals intelligence, and that even if he had just saved 5,000 men from being massacred in their sleep, he had also committed a serious breach of military regulations that would have to be investigated and addressed regardless of the outcome. The German attack came at midnight, exactly as Vincent had heard them coordinate. Came with the thunder of artillery and the grinding roar of panzer engines, and the particular sound that massed armor makes when it moves across frozen ground. And Vincent sat in his foxhole monitoring frequencies and listening to the battle develop 10 kilometers away, hearing American voices on the radio that were tense and urgent, but organized and prepared instead of panicked and surprised. He could tell from the radio traffic that his warning had reached the division command, could hear officers coordinating defensive positions and calling for artillery support and moving reserve units into position to meet the German thrust. And even though the battle was fierce and the outcome uncertain, the Americans were fighting as an organized force instead of being slaughtered as they slept, which meant Vincent's unauthorized transmission had accomplished exactly what he had intended, even though the cost of that accomplishment remained to be determined. The battle lasted through the night and into the next morning, lasted through hours of artillery exchanges and tank engagements and infantry fighting in the frozen woods around Bastogne, and Vincent stayed at his observation post, monitoring radio traffic and providing updates on German movements when he could intercept their communications, still doing his job as a forward observer, even though he knew that somewhere in the chain of command, people were asking questions about the unauthorized transmission that had started the whole sequence of defensive preparations. At 06:47 hours on December 16th, with the German attack finally stalled and American lines holding despite heavy pressure, Vincent received a radio message on the military frequency, which had mysteriously started working again around about 200 hours, ordering him to return to division headquarters for debriefing, and the tone of the message was carefully neutral in the way that military communications always are when someone is in trouble, but nobody wants to say so explicitly over the radio. Vincent walked the 10 kilometers back to headquarters through snow and mud and the debris of battle, past American troops who were exhausted and bloodied, but alive because they had been awake and in position when the attack came, instead of sleeping in tents that would have become their coffins. And he wanted to feel pride about that. But mostly, he felt numb and tired and worried about what was going to happen when he reached headquarters and had to explain why he had violated communication security protocols during what turned out to be the opening hours of the Battle of the Bulge. The headquarters was chaos when he arrived, officers shouting into radios and messengers running between buildings, and the organized confusion that happens when a military organization realizes it's in the middle of a major enemy offensive. And Vincent was directed to a building where a colonel and a signals intelligence captain were waiting to interview him about his transmission on the civilian frequency. The colonel's name was Harrison, and he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite and never smiled, and he sat behind a desk covered with maps and radio logs and looked at Vincent with an expression that could have meant anything from admiration to fury. "Corporal Drake," Colonel Harrison said, and his voice was flat and gave nothing away. "You transmitted classified military information on an unsecured civilian frequency at 23:40 hours yesterday evening. Is that correct?" Vincent stood at attention and decided that honesty was probably his only option at this point, since lying would only make things worse, and he said, "Yes, sir. I transmitted a warning about the German attack on the civilian frequency because all military channels were jammed and I could not reach division headquarters through authorized means." The colonel looked at him for a long moment and then said, "You understand that using civilian frequencies for military communications is a serious breach of security protocol that could result in court-martial?" And Vincent said, "Yes, sir, I understand that. But I believed the immediate tactical situation justified the risk because 5,000 men were about to be attacked without warning, and I had no other way to alert them in time." The signals intelligence captain, a younger officer named Morrison who looked like he had been up all night, leaned forward and said, "Corporal, your transmission was intercepted by German signals intelligence. We confirmed that from captured radio logs, they heard everything you said, including your unit designation and position. You gave them intelligence that could have been used to target our forces." Vincent felt his stomach drop, but he kept his voice steady and said, "Sir, respectfully, the Germans already knew where our forces were positioned, because they were launching a coordinated attack against those exact positions. My transmission did not reveal anything they didn't already know." Morrison looked like he wanted to argue, but Colonel Harrison held up a hand and said, "The corporal has a point, Captain. The Germans clearly had excellent intelligence about our dispositions before he ever touched his radio." Then Harrison turned back to Vincent and said, "Your warning reached a signal company operator who was monitoring civilian frequencies for resistance traffic. He recognized the urgency and relayed your message to regimental command, who initiated alert procedures that got most of the division into defensive positions before the attack began. Preliminary casualty reports suggest you probably saved several hundred lives at minimum and prevented the complete destruction of at least 2 regiments." Vincent felt something loosen in his chest, but Colonel Harrison wasn't finished, and the colonel's voice got quieter and somehow harder as he said, "However, the fact that your unauthorized action had positive results does not change the fact that you violated explicit communication security protocols. And there are people at Chef who believe you should be court-martialed as an example to prevent other radio operators from making unauthorized transmissions, regardless of their good intentions." The room was silent except for the distant sound of artillery and the muffled voices of officers in other parts of the headquarters, and Vincent understood that his fate was balanced on an edge as thin as the decision he had made the night before, understood that saving 5,000 men might not be enough to protect him from the consequences of breaking rules that the Army considered essential to maintaining discipline and security. Colonel Harrison stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the snow and the smoke rising from distant battles, and after a long moment, he turned back to Vincent and said, "I am recommending that no charges be filed against you, Corporal, because I believe you acted reasonably under extraordinary circumstances, and because the results justified the risk. But I want you to understand that this recommendation is not popular with everyone, and that your action yesterday has created a significant problem for communications doctrine that someone smarter than me is going to have to solve." Vincent spent the rest of December 1944 and most of January 1945 continuing to work as a forward observer radio operator, continuing to monitor frequencies and relay intelligence and follow the regulations that had been drilled into him at Fort Monmouth. But something had changed in how other soldiers treated him, because word had spread through the division about the corporal who had broken the rules to save 5,000 men, and nobody seemed to think he should be punished for it. Officers would nod at him when they passed. Soldiers he didn't know would thank him for the warning that had woken them up before the German attack. And even the signals intelligence people who had been furious about his unauthorized transmission seemed to have softened their position once they saw the casualty reports that showed what would have happened if those regiments had been caught sleeping. The Army never formally changed its regulations about civilian frequencies, never issued new doctrine that authorized the kind of transmission Vincent had made. But there were quiet conversations in Signal Corps headquarters about the need for flexible thinking in extreme situations and about the difference between following rules and achieving objectives. Vincent received a Bronze Star in February 1945 with a citation that carefully avoided mentioning the civilian frequency transmission, but praised his initiative and decisive action in providing critical tactical intelligence that enabled friendly forces to prepare effective defensive measures against a major enemy offensive. And when the medal was pinned to his uniform, Vincent understood that this was the Army's way of acknowledging what he had done without officially endorsing his violation of communication security protocols. He finished the war in Europe, working radio intercept and signals intelligence, finished with a service record that included commendations for his work during the Battle of the Bulge, and no mention at all of the court-martial that had seemed inevitable on the morning of December 16, 1944. When Vincent came home to Newark in late 1945, he went back to being a postal clerk like his father, went back to believing in systems and procedures and the importance of following rules. But he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the right thing to do is the wrong thing according to regulations, and that the difference between those two categories is something you have to figure out for yourself in the moment when it matters. He never talked much about the war, never told elaborate stories about his service, or tried to claim more credit than he deserved. But occasionally, someone would ask him if he had seen combat, and he would say, "I was a radio operator. Mostly, I just listened to frequencies and followed procedures." And that was technically true, even though it left out the part about the night he had decided that 5,000 lives mattered more than following the manual. The story of Vincent's warn transmission became part of Signal Corps training folklore, became one of those examples that instructors would mention when teaching about communications doctrine and the importance of flexible thinking. And over the years, the details got smoothed and simplified until it became the time a radio operator used a civilian frequency to warn troops about an attack, without much context about the specific circumstances or the genuine risk Vincent had taken, or the fact that his decision could easily have ended differently. In 1967, a military communications researcher tracked Vincent down and asked him about that night, asked him how he had made the decision to use the forbidden frequency and whether he had been confident it was the right choice. And Vincent said, "I wasn't confident about anything except that men were going to die if I didn't do something, and using the civilian frequency was the only something I could think of that might work. So I did it, and hoped it wouldn't get me court-martialed before I could find out if it had helped." The researcher asked if Vincent would make the same choice again, and Vincent thought about it for a long time before answering. Thought about the regulations and the risks and the 5,000 men who had survived that night because someone had broken the rules. And finally he said, "I think I would make the same choice again, but I also think the Army was right to be worried about what I did. Because if every radio operator started deciding for themselves which rules to follow and which rules to break, then you'd have chaos instead of military discipline. So the answer is both yes, I would do it again, and yes, I understand why it was wrong according to the system. And I don't know how to resolve that contradiction, except to say that sometimes you have to trust people to make impossible choices and hope they choose well." Vincent Drake died in 1984 at the age of 63. Died quietly in the same Newark house where he had grown up and where he had returned after the war. And his obituary mentioned that he had been a World War II veteran and a postal worker and a father of 3, but didn't mention the night he had used a forbidden frequency to save 5,000 lives, because that story had never made it into civilian records, and Vincent had never been the kind of person who needed public recognition for doing what he thought was right. The Bronze Star was in a drawer with his other service medals and decorations, and his children knew he had served in the Signal Corps, but they didn't know the details because Vincent had always deflected questions about the war with vague answers about radio work and communications duty, and it wasn't until years after his death that one of his daughters found his military records and read the citation for the Bronze Star and started asking questions about what exactly decisive action in providing critical tactical intelligence meant in the context of the Battle of the Bulge. The story she eventually pieced together from military archives and interviews with surviving members of Vincent's division became a small footnote in the larger history of the Battle of the Bulge, became one of those interesting anecdotes that military historians mention when discussing communications and command decisions during the German offensive. But the core lesson of what Vincent did that night has survived in Signal Corps training in a form that would probably surprise him. The lesson isn't about when to break rules or how to decide which regulations to violate, because those are questions that don't have clean answers and that the Army can't teach in a systematic way. The lesson is about the importance of initiative and creative problem-solving when systems fail, about the need for soldiers to understand not just the procedures they're following, but the purposes those procedures serve. and about trusting people to make difficult choices when circumstances fall outside the boundaries of doctrine and manual. The civilian frequency that Vincent used in 1944 is no longer forbidden for military use, because the technology and security environment have changed so much that the specific regulation he violated doesn't exist anymore. But the broader principle he grappled with, the tension between following established procedures and achieving mission objectives when those two things conflict, remains as relevant as ever in military training and operations. Modern communication systems have backup frequencies and encryption and redundancies that are supposed to prevent the kind of situation Vincent faced. But anyone who has served in actual combat knows that systems fail and situations arise that weren't covered in training, and that sometimes you have to make a choice between doing things by the book and doing things that might actually work. The 5,000 men whose lives were saved by Vincent's unauthorized transmission went on to fight through the rest of the Battle of the Bulge and into Germany, went on to come home and start families and build lives and create a future that they wouldn't have had if a radio operator in a frozen foxhole had decided that following regulations was more important than sending a warning. Most of them never knew who had warned them or how the warning had been sent, never knew about the forbidden frequency or the risk Vincent had taken, or the fact that his career had hung in the balance for weeks after that transmission. They just knew that they had been woken up before the attack instead of dying in their sleep. And that was enough, because survival is its own justification, and the details of how survival was achieved matter less than the fact of being alive. Vincent Drake passed away in 1984 at the age of 63. His unauthorized transmission on a civilian frequency on December 15, 1944, warned approximately 5,000 American troops about the German offensive that began the Battle of the Bulge. Casualty reports suggest his warning prevented the complete destruction of at least 2 regiments and saved several hundred lives. He was never court-martialed for violating communication security protocols. He received a Bronze Star with a citation that carefully avoided mentioning the civilian frequency. The specific regulation he violated no longer exists, but the principle he grappled with, choosing between procedure and mission, is still taught in Signal Corps training. When asked if he would make the same choice again, Drake said, "I wasn't confident about anything, except that men were going to die if I didn't do something. Sometimes the wrong frequency is the right choice." If you found Vincent's story worth remembering, consider subscribing. There are more untold stories like this. People who saved lives by breaking the rules everyone said couldn't be broken. Thanks for watching.